Welcome everyone to today's breakout session about how we are reusing data. I hope you enjoyed this morning's session and had a chance to go to the networking area. For this session, we have two presenters, Oliver Guinan from Google, who will speak to you about the Environmental Insights Project. Oliver is based in San Francisco, therefore this is a pre-recorded segment. Our second speaker is Chris Lees, who will speak about data standards, and we will then be joined by James Kavanagh from the RICS for a panel discussion. If you have any questions today for a speaker, please do ask it in the chat function. We will go to the questions at the end of the presentations. Oliver Guinan is a 16-year veteran from the internet industry. He's from Tullamore, County Offaly, here in Ireland, and is currently based in the San Francisco Bay Area. After starting his career in internet mapping industry, Oliver has gone on to develop, deploy, and support some of the largest consumer internet applications around the world. This included a number of years at Yahoo in their media group, which includes the world's leading news, finance, and sports websites. Oliver has worked at several startup companies that were focused on simplifying the process of turning large quantities of data into manageable information. Oliver holds a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland. He is currently leading a software engineering team at Google that exploits the information and environmental information for our benefit. We'll go to Oliver's presentation.
I'm Ollie Guinan, the engineering manager for Google's Environmental Insights Explorer application. I'm here today to talk a little bit about how Google does some of its work in tackling global problems using remote sensing and how we try to drive action in the world with our knowledge of the world itself. So a little bit about me. I'm actually from Ireland originally. I studied computer science in Trinity. I'm from Tullamore, actually. Moved to the US about 20 years ago, and been working at Google for about 6 years, mostly on remote sensing and projects like this. My first job out of college actually was with Mapflow, which was one of the first mapping companies in Dublin, based on Merrion Square. So some of you might remember Mapflow. It's been around for a little while. So I'm going to talk mostly today about Environmental Insights Explorer, the tool that we use to track the carbon footprint of the world at local level. But I'll talk a little bit also about where Google started moving into this space and some of the other efforts that we've made here too. So why carbon footprints? Well, we've all got a very clear goal to reduce the world's carbon footprint in half by 2030 in order to keep warming to a manageable level, and by 2050 to achieve carbon neutrality so that we can minimize the amount of change that we know is on the way and is coming. So at Google, we got a broad purpose to build technology to help people. We do this by organizing the world's information, making it universally accessible and useful. And we've done this in the remote sensing and the for good space in a couple of interesting ways. So we have a project called AirView, which monitors air quality at hyperlocal level, so at street level. We put air quality sensors on the street view cars that you may already be familiar with. They've driven in places like Copenhagen, Amsterdam, London, several cities in the United States. And then we publish these maps. We've got a couple in Oakland, California that were produced with the Environmental Defense Fund. And we worked with some of the universities in Copenhagen and London to produce the maps of those cities. We monitor several pollutants, nitrogen dioxide, PM2.5, black carbon, several others, using those sensors and make those maps available for policymakers and the general public. We actually recently announced that this program is coming to Dublin. So Dublin will have one of the first electric street view cars with these air quality sensors on it that we'll use to create the first hyperlocal map of air quality around Dublin. People may also be familiar with Project Sunroof, which tracks the solar potential of every rooftop that we map with our highest quality camera systems. This doesn't cover every part of the world, but a lot of the developed world is covered by this. So as it happens, we have maps for several cities in Ireland, not everywhere, but certainly Dublin, Cork, Galway, Limerick, Belfast, Athlone are all in there. Dublin, I think, down south as far as Bray happens to be in there. And with the system, we take a typical year, look at the sun traveling over the sky in 15-minute segments of the year. We look at the shading and the solar potential, add all that together and give you the solar potential throughout the year for your home. We have the Global Forest Watch, which tracks the forests of the world as new forests show up and forests are cut away. You can monitor that in great detail. The Global Water Project, which monitors the fresh water in the world as part of one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and Global Fishing Watch, which uses remote sensing and the identity beacons from ships to track where and when fishing is happening in the world, to make sure that areas are not being overfished and that protected areas are being taken care of. I work as part of the group that we call Geo for Good, and our mission there is to have positive social and environmental impact using Google's knowledge of the world, and to do that at large scale. We started focusing our efforts on cities and the carbon footprint of cities a couple of years ago. Cities are interesting because 70% of the world's carbon footprint is attributable to cities and actions that happen in cities. So even if some beef lived its happy life, miles outside of a city, the burger from that beef was consumed within the city. So it's the emissions of that animal are attributable to the city. So we put all the people in the cities. That tends to be where the carbon footprint shows up. Cities are also a really interesting spot to take action at local government level. Positive impact there does tend to impact a lot of people. So we have an internal goal to help over 500 cities reduce their carbon, or cities and local governments to reduce their carbon footprint by a gigaton by 2030. That's about the carbon footprint of all of Japan. So that's the 7th largest emitter in the world, so a really significant impact. And this is a goal that Google has committed to publicly. The CEO has talked about it several times over the last few months as well. So there are a bunch of obstacles to overcome. They're getting the right data sets and making those data sets available to people, to policymakers in a way that's easy to understand, committing the resources and the time to creating all of these pieces. So we created this tool called the Environmental Insights Explorer. And we try to fill the data gap in particular with this tool. So using our knowledge of the world, we can produce the carbon footprint of a city due to transport and buildings. The third major component, waste, we haven't yet found a way that we could make a particularly big difference there, so we didn't try to sort of shoehorn something in. But for transport and building emissions, we think we've got uniquely good data. We did this not on our own, but in partnership with the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, C40, and some of the other large organizations that bring cities together so that they can take actions that are going to drive the largest impacts. We've also provided some money to cities to sort of grease the wheels and get them over the initial hump of creating their first carbon inventories, measuring what that footprint is, and then starting to take action. So we've done this in a privacy-safe way. So if you're familiar with Google Maps and the traffic view in Google Maps, for example, that data itself comes from individual people moving around the world. We want to be able to use that data in aggregate, put some noise into it as well, so that no one can really pull their own data back out, or you can't sort of recognize individual people from that data set. We use a lot of machine learning and analytics to turn that into a data set that's logical at yearly level. And if you actually look at some of the cities that you recognize in there, or that you understand well in there, you should be able to recognize the patterns that you expect in those cities. So we have these 3 data sets that we focus on initially: the building emissions and transport for the carbon footprint, and the rooftop solar potential for carbon offsets, so that you can sort of see both sides and can start to make trades in okay, I can reduce my emissions, but I can also have some offsets if I lean into solar potential. For building emissions data, Google has pretty good knowledge of what most buildings are used for. That knowledge comes from people telling us, hey, I own this business. These are the opening hours. This is the kind of business we are. It comes from street view cars that drive down the streets and survey at large scale. It comes from satellites and many other sources. So we combine that the building footprints and so on in particular come from satellites and airplanes and other remote sensing sources. So we combine all that data to give us a view of the building usage from another data source. We have the carbon footprint for each of the building use types. For example, hospitals use much more energy per square meter than residential buildings. Hotels tend to use a lot more energy per square meter than retail spaces, for example. So we use all that knowledge together to create the carbon footprint due to buildings. We also understand the energy, the grid, and how clean or dirty the electrical grid is, what the heating and cooling sources are for buildings. So all that data together gets us the carbon footprint of the buildings. Then we also have transport emissions, again, from that traffic data. As I mentioned earlier, you can tell whether somebody's in a car, walking, on a bicycle, on a bus. We aggregate all that data together. We can tell whether those trips start outside a city and end inside, start inside and end outside, or start and end within the city. All of which is useful for carbon accounting purposes. They ask for the breakdown in those particular buckets, which we're able to help out with. Mountain View here has got pretty good solar potential. You can sort of see from that map that not every building is quite the same. There are areas that are shaded by trees or shaded by other tall buildings, but in general, Mountain View has pretty good solar potential. Although you can also see from that view that only 6% of the rooftops that are high solar potential actually have solar panels on them at the moment. So there's quite an opportunity there to expand that. I mentioned the air quality data that we've been working on. Also, there's a nice correlation between air quality and carbon footprint. As the transport grid becomes more electrified, there's less nitrogen dioxide, for example, that's produced from tailpipe emissions. So we should see the air quality improve as we see the shift towards more electric transportation. So this view this map that you see here shows where the AirView cars have driven around London. In particular, they focused on central London and the low emission zone, congestion zone around central London, which had expanded recently. And they're really looking in great detail, I think, as part of the Breathe London project. At the effect of that expanded congestion zone on air quality itself. We like policy changes to really happen at local level. This means engaging with local government, engaging with the policymakers, the funders, and so on, and trying to bring the best practices of one city across to other cities. We did a lot of analysis to make sure that we were producing data that was high quality. And this graph here actually shows a correlation between the Google data and traffic on the M50 in Dublin. The company that runs the M50, they're really very, very good at counting all the cars, trucks, and so on that pass over the toll bridge segment. That's also a nice isolated road segment. So we did an analysis of our traffic on that road segment, compared it to what the M50 folks were producing. And you can see the correlation right here. It's very tight. There's a little bit of a time shift because we know when trips start and end, but not exactly when somebody crosses that particular road segment. So I believe we tagged to the start time of the trip. So you'll see we just shifted a little bit in time. Doesn't make a big difference when you annualize the traffic as we do for the carbon footprint, but we were pretty excited about the correlations that we were getting here. Overall, we want to support cities, measure what's happening in the world, do some trade-offs and planning between different actions that they could potentially take, support the actions themselves, so whether that's putting in bike lanes or expanding, expanding the bus fleet, electrifying cars, putting in solar panels, and then track the impact of those changes over time and do it in an unbiased way. So you can see some of the places where this has already happened. San Jose, California, is using the solar potential that we produced to set a target to become the first gigawatt solar city in the US. So that would be using about a third of their total solar potential. Copenhagen, we've been doing the hyperlocal air quality monitoring. Copenhagen has actually used that data to make some changes to how some of their core infrastructure runs and better manage some of their park systems. And that data is available publicly at insights.sustainability.google. A little closer to home here in Dublin, we've worked with Smart Dublin and the Dublin City Council to monitor the changes in biking patterns across the city. Dublin City Council has been working hard to put more cycling infrastructure in and to encourage people to bike more. So we've been monitoring those changes over time, making sure that they are having the impact that's expected. Mountain View is reporting their greenhouse gas inventory using the environmental insights data, much cheaper and more current than their previous method, which actually used the traffic survey, which was several years out of date. Hartford, Connecticut has already started to commit to some local policy changes using the data. Kyoto, Japan, famous, of course, for the Kyoto Protocol, which was one of the protocols before the Paris Accord, used our data to produce their carbon inventory for the very first time. Lots of cities have been excited about the data, the kind of policy changes that they can start to support using the data. They can also use the data to explain to the public why these policies make sense and why they are chosen over some of the other potential policy changes that are available. So we have hundreds of cities currently available, many thousands of others that are in private access generally. The cities like to see the data privately before we publish it publicly. In Ireland, all of the councils in the Dublin area, so Fingal, Dublin City Council, South Dublin, Dún Laoghaire, Rathdown, and actually County Dublin are all available publicly in environmental insights. You can go to insights.sustainability.google and look at each one of those. And you recognize, I think you should be able to recognize some of the traffic patterns in particular that show up there. There are a lot of folks who travel a long distance, who drive a long distance in and out of Dublin to work, for example. You get a lot of folks who use the train. You can really see some of those patterns, and you can see the difference between Dublin city centre and some of the other little more suburban local government areas. So we've been trying to connect across all of these areas. We've been working closely with partners and the consultants who work with cities, who have always worked with cities and just needed better data to support the story. I would ask anybody who's interested to take a look at insights.sustainability.google. Look at some of the public data in there, give us some feedback on it, and let us know if it meets your needs, if there are areas that we could improve it. If you're working with local governments, we do have data available for most of the local government areas in Ireland. So if this data is interesting to you, feel free to reach out and let us know. Thanks for listening, and we're excited to hear your feedback.
That was really interesting, and thank you very much, Oliver. If anyone has a direct question for Oliver, will you please send it to events@scsi.ie and we will pass it on. Now to our next presenter, Chris Lees, who has spent over 30 years in technology and 25 of those are in real estate. He's passionate about the role and value data can play in today's information-enabled world. Blending his background in mathematics, in which he holds an MA from Cambridge University, music, playing the piano and the guitar, and tenacity, most recently tested in his endurance running passion, and curiosity. Chris constantly seeks opportunities to innovate operational models for organizational and individual benefit and consults as part of a multidisciplinary team of experts at DataClan. Welcome, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, and good day, everyone. I'm going to try and give a bit of a whistle-stop tour now from a slightly different perspective. I am the technical director at Oscar, who are a global real estate data standards organization. So I wanted to really look at what reuse means. So slightly step back from Oliver's fantastic presentation. Look at a specific and live application here in the UK, the Golden Thread, associated with the new Building Safety Bill being introduced. And then really talk about some of the preconditions as I see them for success. And I'm going to talk about those in terms of some of the lessons that we've learned. So what do we mean by reuse of data? So I think the first example, I suppose, is where we multi-purpose data. So we take one item of data and we reuse that one same item of data in several different activities. An example of that in the kind of real estate context might be the measurement of area. So we could use the area measurement of, let's say, an office to allocate costs. From a corporate, I could allocate costs to my various business units or functions. But I could use that same measurement when I'm renegotiating the lease with my landlord. And the landlord might be using the same measurement when they're conducting valuations or appraisals of that office. You could also think of something like a security badge swipe, which could be used for, of course, securing access to a building or a location, but it could also be used later on for investigating fraud, and it could be used for occupancy planning. So we're taking one single item of data there and reusing it in multiple ways. So another way of looking at reuse is where we're looking at data that gets used in a process. So this is one piece of data that gets used first for one purpose and then for another purpose and then so on through some kind of life cycle or series of activities in a business process. So again, you could think of area measurement, which could be used for space planning first, and then once the space was planned, the same area measurement might then be used for instructing a facility management firm to do the cleaning of that space. Or you could imagine the specification of a fire door installed in a new development that's then used during the repair when the automatic closer on the fire door fails or some such. So you can see there we've got a piece of data that is initially created and then gets used for one thing and then passed on and used in subsequent processes. And of course, in reality, all of those things happen. We have data that gets multi-purposed, we get data that's used in processes and handed on from one use, one activity to the next. But why does this matter? Well, the thing about multi-purposing data is that that can be dangerous because sometimes we'll reuse a piece of data that wasn't really created for the purpose that we're now putting it to. And it might not be fit for the purpose we're putting it to. So we need to be quite careful when we're doing that kind of reuse. But equally, when we're recycling data and using it through a process, there's an effect that I like to call data entropy. It's a bit like thermodynamic entropy. Basically, things become more disordered over time unless you put in some effort to keep them in an ordered state. And in data terms, that just means the quality is going to deteriorate unless you put in the energy, which in this case is really good data governance, to keep the data quality high. So in both these kinds of reuse, there's actually pitfalls and sometimes bear traps that we can fall into. So if we look at the Golden Thread example, the Golden Thread is an element of the new Building Safety Bill being introduced into Parliament any day now. And the Golden Thread describes the information that allows you to understand a building and how to keep the people and the building safe, particularly safe from the catastrophic events of structural collapse and fire. This bill has largely come about following the Grenfell tragedy a few years ago, and is really, really focused on trying to address some of the systemic problems in the construction and operating, building operations industry, if you like, where data is often lost, mislaid, out of date, or inaccurate. So in the Building Safety Bill, this golden thread of information requires some expression. And this is kind of where data standards and indeed other standards start to come into play, because if we're trying to get a whole industry to move forwards, it's no good every organization just completely inventing or reinventing the entire solution themselves. You want to try and get people to act with some consistency. So in this context, we're really looking at this idea that you can look at a building life cycle as a delivery phase followed by an operational phase. And this language comes out of an international standard, ISO 19650, often known as the BIM standards, which express really a whole series of processes that you should make sure you have in place to properly manage construction and operation of real estate. And so when we think about how you might go about ensuring the data is reusable, so that when we create that data during the delivery phase, we can reuse it right the way through that operational phase. The first thing we need to do is make sure that we have effective processes. And for that, we use this 19650 framework. And then the second thing we need to do is make sure that we have a consistent way of expressing the data. And so for that, we use OSCA's our own industry data model, or the industry foundation classes, which is another standard. And OSCA and industry foundation classes, although they're different standards, they have been developed collaboratively, so they interoperate with each other. So it doesn't matter which one you use, you're expressing data in a format that can be understood by either. And then in between those, you get what I'd refer to more as regulatory or professional standards. So this is where you have things like PS 8644, which is in the UK, the new fire safety information standard, and you get gas safety regulations, things that you have to do that sit within the process and express data using these standards. So back to our kind of map of all of this data being reused. How do we practically do this at the moment? Well, the answer is that unfortunately we do it in all sorts of different ways. I'm sure you'll recognize that this reuse mostly happens in Excel, probably sending Excel documents around. We might have some CSV files, we might have some XML files. We probably still have some paper. And if you think I don't have paper, everything we use is now PDFs. PDFs is basically paper when it comes to data reuse. If you require a human being to interpret the data, then you're basically using paper. Data integration between the systems is a big challenge, which is why we have all of these different ways of doing it. But we are making progress, and this is where data standards are important. What data standards do is they provide this unambiguous set of definitions of what the data is. So when we use a term like area, everybody's using the same definition, and that helps us avoid that risk of it not being fit for purpose by reusing it in a multi-purposing way for something that it wasn't designed for. And we also, with data standards, provide a consistent way of expressing the data. So that allows all sorts of different systems to be able to read it without a human being having to read it and rekey it manually. And these are necessary if you're going to integrate systems, and integration of systems is one of the easiest ways to get reuse of data. And many organizations do this, but it's on a kind of ad hoc or point-to-point basis. So effectively just taking two systems they already have and putting in the effort to join them together. And data standards avoid all of that individual effort, and they allow one definition and expression of the data right across an industry. And that means it will work right the way through the supply chain. So what have we learned in doing this? Well, the first thing is that it's complicated to understand all of the different stakeholders that might have an interest in how data is expressed and how it might be reused. This is a picture that you're not expected to be able to read, but this is a simple mind map of just one tiny little fragment of the real estate sector. This is residential tall buildings, residential buildings in the UK. And even here you can see we've got many, many stakeholders, and some of them are listed on the left, and even those break down. So you look at the UK BIM Alliance, and that even that is made up of the UK BIM Framework Group, the BIM for Housing Group, the BIM for Housing Associations Group. There's lots and lots of stakeholders trying to contribute here. The other thing is there's lots of standards out there. So this graphic is actually taken from a report written by Dan Hughes of the Real Estate Data Foundation, entitled The Role of Standards in Enabling a Data-Driven UK Real Estate Market. And he identified more than 300 standards. Now, admittedly, over a third of those are actually OSCE standards, our standards. But that's still an enormously big number. So one of the things that we realized 3 or 4 years ago, actually, was that as a standards body, our role was really more about collaboration than publication. Those multiple standards are a fact. It might be great if there was just one, but that's just not realistic. It's not achievable. So what's really important then is for these multiple standards to at least be consistent and interoperate, so that, as I was describing with the industry foundation classes, IFC and OSCE, it doesn't matter which one you pick, because whichever one you pick, you can interoperate with the other one. And we've been working closely with some key partners, and I've called out a few of them here: Construction Innovation Hub, the NBS, and the Construction Specifications Institute, which is more US focused, in making sure that the stuff that we publish does interoperate with the stuff that they publish. And in many cases, that's just by us including their stuff and republishing it rather than doing anything different at all. And so our role over the last 3 or 4 years, we've realized has become more of an aggregator, so pulling together the work done by other standards bodies where they have the subject matter expertise, but fitting that in together with all of the other stuff that we know from either other partners or that's been created in our own 20-year history. And for that to work, we've got to collaborate with a real partnership mindset. So, it takes a lot of effort to develop standards. So working with real subject matter expertise, it's quite dangerous when you get proxies who think they're an expert, but they're not necessarily doing the job. They might know a lot about it, but data is a very specific, detailed thing. You need people really on the front line to help develop these standards. So getting to those people requires partnering with the groups that those people operate in. And also the patterns of collaboration. We find that different organizations want to work in different ways. And in order to support that, we need to be quite flexible at OSCE in how we would partner with them. So sometimes we have a contractual relationship where an organization publishes standards and we republish them. So we do that, for example, with the CSI I mentioned. We do it with the National Housing Federation here in the UK. And we also do it where we publish to others. So, for example, OSCE publishes standards that are then republished through the Construction Innovation Hub. We also develop partnerships with organizations. So we've been working closely with the Housing Association's Charitable Trust here in the UK for 3+ years now, developing the UK housing data standards, where they know their market, but what we do is we know how to develop standards. So we've brought the two together, they've brought stakeholders in, we've brought their governance and expertise, and we've developed some standards there. We've worked in a similar way with a group called Reamtech, looking at investment management standards. And then the third kind of collaboration we've seen is with the technology providers. So when we're working with technology partners, obviously, ultimately, as I say, systems integration is one of the easiest ways to reuse data. So if you can get the providers of those technologies to sell you the package out of the box that already integrates in a way that's standards based, so you can have confidence in it, that's a massive jump forwards. So I guess just to finish up here, what would I say are the two big takeaways that I would recommend you keep in mind after this session? Well, the first one I would say is education. Educate yourself first. We go into the office, we hire new people, and we expect those people these days to be able to do things like use a mobile phone and use a computer. But how often do we check whether those people know how to use data? Well, we probably should do that. And also, when you've got data, you're presumably, as Oliver was saying, using it to measure the world around you. What are you using to measure your data? In other words, keep an eye on the data. Make sure it's accurate. Make sure you know what it means. Look at data quality benchmarks. So get trained. Shameless plug for the OSCE Academy, which does this kind of training there. And then the other thing is this collaboration. There's a lot of people that say they want to collaborate, but real collaboration means kind of rolling the sleeves up and seeing how you can share expertise and not duplicate activity. That's the key. So pick your partners that can collaborate in that way. And finally, watch this space. The RED Foundation have recently launched a data ethics steering group. And later this year, we'll be launching the data standards steering group. So that should be coming in September. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. So Sarah, do you want me to just go straight on and get to that question on what are the barriers to collaboration on the Golden Thread?
I think I need to come clean on this. I was actually speaking to the technical support and it came out live. So my apologies to everybody else. So what I'm going to say, thank you very much, Chris, for that. That was really, really interesting. We will now be joined by James Kavanagh. James is a chartered surveyor and chartered geographer. James has worked on some of the largest surveying projects in Europe before spending several years working on mapping, surveying and informal land right issues for the United Nations in their Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees. James has a broad experience of surveying and land management in many countries around the world, and James is the director of the land and resources within the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, or the RICS as we all know it. So James, what was your thoughts on what you've heard here today?
I suppose listening to what Oliver said about Google, I think there's some very interesting kind of takeaways for us in the geospatial world about that. And I was particularly interested in how when he spoke about air quality. And, you know, living in London, we have massive issues with air quality. It directly affects the economy and the health of the population. And I think that's one of the drivers behind it. And I think one of the sad things about it, of course, is that it comes down to liability when something terrible happens. So this year we had a court case, one of the first successful court cases, if you can call it that, in London, where the death of a child was directly attributable to air pollution, traffic pollution particularly. And so that creates a certain amount of liability for local authorities. So it's no wonder then that they turn to the use of data to try and mitigate some of those kind of problems. And I think we see the same in the climate end of things. And one thing I would say about, say, Ireland is that, you know, I think there's a huge opportunity there in the whole climate change end of things, not on the carbon reduction end. Well, there still is for us, but on the urbanization, because of the carbon mitigation and offsetting that most of the world will have to do. In the RICS, we've done a lot of work into carbon output in urban areas. They will never be carbon neutral. It will have to be balanced. And it's all about balance in some way with working with the natural environment, such as the recent Dasgupta report, or even Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England's recent book on natural capital. I think that's for a country that's fundamentally kind of still mostly rural. I think that's a great opportunity for entering into that carbon climate economy that will probably happen within the next couple of years. On Chris's thing, I think we had a bit of a discussion yesterday about this, and those of us who've been around a while will remember that you know, BIM has been through a bit of a journey for all of us within the geospatial world, and the golden thread, again based on the back of a tragedy, sadly, is potentially a big shot in the arm for BIM that had sadly entered the doldrums a bit because of these issues, I think, of people working together and interoperability of data use particularly. And one thing I would ask Chris is that where does he see that, you know, the strength of that, you know, a good geospatial model within the golden trend picture? He mentioned Excel sheets, anathema to all good geospatial surveyors when we think about kind of three-dimensional models and all the bells and whistles we can add to data and what is really in the property world, a component world, a lot of metadata attached to good geospatial information. So, you know, the fidelity of that model, you know, its strength of enabling the golden thread end of things, I think will be incredibly important. And just one final element on that, we often speak about smart cities, digital models and BIM, and I know Technical University Dublin has a fine department there dealing with many of these issues. But what we've found in much of the research that we've done and work is that, you know, we have smart cities and stupid buildings. You know, they're both funded differently. They're both on different data platforms. One is privately funded, so the model belongs to a particular kind of individual. One is state funded, and the two don't meet. So there's a kind of you know, those cogs within that big digital model project need to come closer together. And I think that's it's got a huge potential for the geospatial industry, because most of our building stock is already built and it needs to be put into some form of digital model. And but those data standards and how they come together, I think, is a big question for Chris and their area of the community.
Absolutely, I fully agree with you. My takeaway from today is that everything happens somewhere, and that really matters, and that's what we can do. We can bring that certainty to where it is, measure it, record it, and make sure it's there to go into these models or whatever. But the other thing that I found really interesting was the education and the collaboration piece, like how loud and how strong that is and how important it is. And it's something that we need to do if we want to maybe bring together the private and the public sectors for the benefit of future generations going forward to measure these really important things. Now, Chris, I'll come back to that question I bombarded you with a couple of minutes ago. I'm just wondering, what are the barriers to collaboration when working on the Golden Thread? You might talk to us a little bit about that and discuss it with us, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and James's comments were right on the money with respect to that as well. So I think there's a few things. So the first is, I think you can summarize all of the barriers as cultural. But that really, I think, is perhaps an oversimplification, and working with colleagues in trying to clarify what the Golden Thread is really going to mean for all of these stakeholders. It highlights really the range of understanding and knowledge about what's possible, both in terms of at the leading edge, but also, what's achievable by all of these stakeholders. Remember, when we're talking about a building, we're talking about massive developers, massive operators, massive construction supply organizations, also right down to private landlords with maybe just a few buildings, individual sole trader tradespeople who are going in and doing repairs. All of these people have to participate, and that makes it complex. I think one of the things James talked about with respect to BIM, I think is right as well, that this is an opportunity to reinvigorate the application of BIM. But one of the things that's perhaps gone a bit wrong with BIM is that it built a reputation as being solely about the three-dimensional model. And as you said, James, actually the metadata is oftentimes the more important part. And then obviously, in many cases, you need both of those things. But if you're looking at, one of the examples I gave of the fire door with the automatic closer that fails, you absolutely need to know where that is, because you need to know which door it is, which fire compartment it belongs to, or fire compartments, hopefully. It should have one on either side with a bit of luck. But you also need to know what was the specification of that door. What was its, fire stopping or smoke stopping or heat penetration stopping rating? What kind of closer should it have on it? And what kind of closer did it have on it before it failed? And that's all in the metadata. And I think this is an area where things like, Revit and these providers of the CAD tools that have somehow kind of owned BIM in some ways really need to step up, because they're not great at the metadata piece. They have varying degrees of effectiveness on the three-dimensional modeling piece, the spatial modeling, but not so good on the actual metadata. For example, none of them, certainly none of the mainstream ones, allow you to have any structured metadata. It's all very simple, list-based, simple free text kind of attribute you can add, and that's no good if you're trying to describe something even as moderately complex as a installation certificate or a commissioning certificate. Never mind if it's something more complicated, like the participation in a fire compartment. So I think the cultural shift needed, I think, is at two ends. So at the one end, we as an entire industry, and I mean real estate quite broadly there, all of our component parts, all of the surveying professions, but also all of those other contributors to the built environment, I think really need to step up and stop assuming that somehow we can get away with not being data literate. So that's one thing. If you're not competent in data, if you can't use data as well as you can use your phone, then you've got to ask yourself, what are you doing in this kind of job? So that's a bit of it. But I think the other part then is, so let's be skilled, as you said, Sarah, education. But then the other part of it is, let's not allow the lowest common denominator to drive where the industry standards should be. And I think that's happened quite a lot in the past, that this fear that people won't be able to come along, they'll not be able to continue. Honestly, if some of the construction supply chain is not able to participate in a more sophisticated, safer market, then that's probably a good thing.
My own take on this is that, like, some of today's children probably are the most exciting thing that will happen, because they're not going to tolerate some of the ways that we're handling data at the moment. They've grown up in a universal world where they're using the likes of city skylines, whatever, playing in those environments with ease. They're all spatial, they're 3D. So when they come to looking at land, property, construction, they'll expect this, they'll want it, they're conversant in it. So I think that's something that's going to come through and solve itself with time, James, any other comments there from yourself regarding what you've heard today?
I think one of the big aspects, I think, for us as an industry and a profession is that the fact that what Chris is talking about and what we've concentrated on in the world of geospatial and BIM is around new build and new construction. That's what we tend to focus on because it's easier to do. We can see the components, but we have a vast amount of built environment stock that we have very, very little information on. We're not sure of, even from a climate change point of view, how much electricity most buildings use, how much water they use, just, those basics, fundamentals of energy and environmental usage or waste usage or people footfall and all those kind of issues. And I think until we get the majority of our built environment up to some level of being able to be integrated into those kind of bigger systems of digital twins, I think we will really struggle. Like I'd be amazed to see a stat, for instance, like what percentage of London or any large city, has individual level, even basic level 2 BIM models available for most buildings. I think it would be incredibly small, and I think it'd be incredibly difficult to access because there would be no kind of consistent held database, like Chris mentioned. And just as a last thing, Chris mentioned the RED Foundation, and one of the big things that we're really dealing with and are getting to grips with now within the global geospatial profession is around the reuse of data and its ethical reuse. And I think this comes back to Oliver's initial presentation. Those bigger issues about how we use it, particularly within real estate and the built environment and the natural environment, are going to be quite critical to us as we develop as a profession and mature over the next few years. Chris, did you want to update about the RED end of things?
Yeah, I mean,
just before
thanks, James. Sorry, Sam.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to add in there that, like, it's 20 years ago since we've had a national building stock survey in Ireland, or even more than that. So, like, maybe we're starting the next time round when we go to do that, we might look at doing that basic BIM model of some of our towns and villages. That's something I struggle with myself. How come we can only get basic mapping? How come we're not getting street mapping, from our national mapping agencies? Maybe that's the next iteration that we might see coming down the road. I don't know. Now, back to your other question. Sorry to interrupt there.
No, I think it's a great point, because a lot of that stuff's kind of foundational, right? If you can't get that context set, as you say, down to like street level, then where are you going to hang all of these other things off?
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, James, on the RED Foundation, they some people listening today might have had the benefit of tuning into a FIABSE session yesterday, which was 4 members from the Real Estate Data Foundation Data Ethics Steering Group. That was a fantastic conversation. They were really, data ethics from a reuse of data perspective is an absolutely massive issue. And if you listen to that, you'd have heard the panelists there describing it as probably the single biggest risk that's out there in terms of the way the real estate industry is using data. And this is just down to the fact that we've all got very excited about data and we're using a lot of data, but are we really thinking about the people, or are we just focusing solely on the data? It's actually something that's very close to my heart, because when I was working for Zurich Insurance, one of the things we did is we did people tracking in our buildings, so tracking our staff as they moved around the buildings. And it was interesting yesterday in the FIABC session that what came out was that actually people are pretty comfortable with you using their personal data as long as you tell them and they understand what you're using it for, and obviously therefore have some degree of ability to choose. But people are pretty willing, and that's what we found at Zurich. We told everybody what we were doing, literally, that we're tracking them in 3 different ways. Their location and time spent in different parts of the building. This is very personal stuff. And I'll never forget a meeting I had with the head of the union in one of the buildings we were doing this in, and I explained to him what we're doing, and he was like, "Yeah, I can get behind that, because what you're doing is you're trying to improve the working environment for my members. That's a good thing. Thank you. Please proceed." So there's that element that this data ethics steering group at the RED Foundation is doing some really great work investigating this and trying to put in place some frameworks. Google the Real Estate Data Foundation, have a look at their data ethics statements. I'd definitely encourage you to do that. And as I briefly mentioned, Dan and the Real Estate Data Foundation are setting up a similar thing for data standards. Dan's asked me if I wouldn't mind sharing that. So watch this space for the Real Estate Data Foundation Data Standards Steering Group coming soon.
Chris, I have a question for you there. It's the impact of bad data on projects multiplied by BIM, etc. And that could have a massive cost implication on our profession. So what we're wondering, or not just our profession, but in general, so how can GEOs mitigate against this?
So I think the key thing here is, and in fact, Yusra from CBRE yesterday referenced this. I think what everybody's got to remember is why are we collecting the data? Whether it's geospatial data, the kind of metadata or asset data, people data, whatever it is, environmental data, all of these things, we need to understand the why and keep that really front and center. So if we're focusing on creating a really good geospatial model, then let's really think through why we're doing that. It's not about ticking a BIM level 2 box. BIM level 2 is a means to an end. We've got to keep in mind what the end is. So, for example, in the Golden Thread, the end is to keep people and buildings safe. So everything we do needs to be in service of that goal, not in service of checking some box or meeting some contractual need. Now, having said that, of course, everybody's under pressure to deliver contracts as cheap as possible. Therefore, we've got to get smarter about what goes in the contracts.
Very good. James, this is a question from me to you. I'm just wondering, is the Golden Thread like the warning, the early warning signs that our general boundaries might see an adjustment coming down the road if it comes in? What are your thoughts on that?
The canary in the coal mine of all these
exactly.
things. Well, I think so. And I think Chris's kind of that last question was very important, because it ties directly into what surveyors do, like right to the core of what we do. It's about cost and value. The additional cost of that, integrated BIM model results in additional value on a social context, but also on a value and asset, an increased asset value to the client themselves. And I think we have to get better at being able to kind of create that narrative more clearly to our clients, that the additional costs of good geospatial information results in additional value, either social or economic. But yeah, I think the general boundary system, things will have to be tied together. It's a fuzzy data set, and fuzzy data sets don't really work in like we've kind of mooched our way around these things and trying to make things fit. We use transformations to downgrade our GNSS readings into international grid coordinates. We do the same with boundaries, and I think a level of we've done the same with GIS over the years. We even do the same with BIM, and I think we will come to the realization that general boundaries as that fundamental element of the parcel, and then the building within that, it needs that kind of framework. And It's
The
that
early
kind
warning
of
signs,
classic
maybe.
Severus, yeah, the classic Severus mantra of working from the whole to the part, isn't it? You know, if the parcel is set to a certain accuracy, well, therefore the building or whatever is within that needs to then follow on.
Just thanks very much, James. I'm thinking that myself, to be honest. A last question for the two of you. Emerging trends in and ethics in real estate. What are the challenges that lie ahead for us?
You want to go first, James?
I think it's an education issue to realize that there is an issue in the first place. As Chris said, you know, it's not just about collecting the data; it's about actually understanding why you're doing that, and you know the potential issues that could be within it, or what it's potentially going to be used for. You know, the issues of bias, unconscious and otherwise, within algorithms. The fact that geospatial information and property level information has been used for big decisions. You know, big economic decisions, but also big social decisions. Where are we going to put affordable housing? Who's going to get into it? You know, the levels of information, like Chris said, that his former companies hold on individuals, all those kind of different issues, and the location element of that and the geographic element of it is going to be quite key to the future. So I think it's something that, you know, should be it should be taught to a lot of younger surveyors, and I think they're much more probably, you know, sharp on it than we were in previous generations. Because look what's happened in the last year. For instance, track and trace apps. Some populations have been quite good on it and jumped into it. Not where we are, Chris. You know, people didn't like track and trace. There was a social problem around that. You know, people didn't trust where their data was going to. It affected, you know, lockdowns and all kinds of issues. So these have big ramifications.
Yeah, and you know, I think that's right. I mean, some of the people listening might remember that there was a case, I think it was in Swansea, South Wales, let's say, where the police used automatic facial recognition in public spaces, and this was challenged by a gentleman who claimed this was a breach of his rights, and it was quite interesting that it was. Effectively, it went through the courts all the way up to the appeals court in the end. And while the initial ruling was that none of his rights had been breached, the Court of Appeal did uphold some of the basis of the complaint. And why I think it's important to reference that case is because the Court of Appeal, as I recall, did find that actually the GDPR provisions were met, but there were, I think it was human rights and the public service, I forget what that act is called, but public service data protection things were maybe not. But irrespective, my point is here that the key is not to see this as a box checking exercise. It's not, oh, we've done GDPR, therefore we're okay. Data ethics is that. It's about putting the person first. It's not, can we do this? It's should we do this? That's the question that we should have at the heart of the data ethics, in my opinion.
Put people first. We've run over, so I would just like thank you very much, James and Chris. There was some great questions there, and the entire I found very interesting, to be honest.